Hey folks, how you doing today? We will talk about international trade. Now the big question today is whether or not countries should or should not engage in trade pacts, or if countries should rather be an isolationist country and only producing within its own borders. So there's a lot of support in the literature that would advocate for more trade pacts, trade deals, as opposed to trade barriers, because trade pacts, trade deals usually leads to a more efficient outcome, thereby benefiting both countries or the countries that are signing on to a trade pact, a trade deal. And we can kind of focus on the concept of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage. So by definition, it's when a country, a nation, is able to produce at a lower opportunity cost. That would be the country's comparative advantage. For example, let's look at two goods, apples and oranges. Here we can draw a graph to represent a country's ability to produce apples and oranges. On the x-axis, we can put apples measured in tons of apples, 0 our point of origin, and on the y-axis we can put oranges, also measured in tons. So now we can look at one example. Let's call this the United States. The U.S. could produce 0 apples and 400 oranges. We can call this point A. The U.S. could also produce 400 apples and 200 oranges. We can call this point B. Or the U.S. could produce 800 apples and 0 oranges. We can call this point C. And now we can draw what we call a budget constraint for the United States, which means that the United States would like, if it could, to produce somewhere beyond this curve, although it cannot because it would be impossible without additional resources. They could produce within this curve, but why would they? That would be considered inefficient. So they have the option of producing at either point A, point B, point C, or anywhere along the constraint, as this would be seen as efficient based on the resources that the U.S. has. So chances are that the United States is going to produce at point B a combination of apples and oranges. We can now use the information and put that on a chart. United States. Now we can put here apples measured in tons, oranges also measured in tons. And we're going to focus on point B. And point B on the x-axis, apples, is 400. And point B on the y-axis, oranges, is 200. So now we want to know exactly what is the country, in this case the United States, what is their opportunity cost of 1 apple to 1 orange. So for that, we need to know how to calculate the U.S.'s opportunity costs. We can then also do the same thing here and put here apples. That's our x-axis. And oranges, which represents our y-axis. Now we could see that opportunity costs is a function of what you will sacrifice over what you will gain. So in the case of the United States, if we were looking at producing apples, the U.S. will sacrifice oranges. And that would mean 200, what you will sacrifice, over what you will gain, apples, of 400. And this gives us 1/2 of oranges. So now we can say that the United States, if it chooses to produce one more apple, it's going to give up opportunity cost, half of production of an orange. Produce one more apple, U.S. must give up half of production of an orange. Now for the orange category, opportunity costs, if the U.S. would focus on oranges, it's going to sacrifice apples. The apples would be 400 on the numerator. What they're going to gain would be oranges at 200. 400 over 200 gives us 2 apples. So if the U.S. were to focus on producing oranges, it's going to give up 2 apples. So for every 1 orange the U.S. produce, it's going to give up on producing 2 apples. So it seems as if that this has a higher opportunity cost than this when producing apples. So it seems as if that the United States would be better off in producing apples. In producing apples and apples only, so we would say that point C might be the better point in terms of producing at a comparative advantage. So to put this into context, we need then to know exactly what other country or countries are there available to be able to trade U.S.'s production of apples. And now let's look at a second country and to see what their constraint looks like. So here we have a graph. Again, on the x-axis, we're going to have apples measured in tons. On the y-axis, we're going to have oranges, also measured in tons. Our point of origin, 0. And let's call this Vietnam. So now we can see that at Vietnam, they can produce 0 apples, and produce 900 oranges, and call that point A. Vietnam could also choose to produce 150 apples and 450 oranges at point B. Vietnam could also, if they choose to, produce only apples at 300 and no oranges, and we can call this point C. And Vietnam also is constrained by a budget line because, again, their resources are limited. They are only able to use what they have, and it's either producing at the efficient point of point A, B, or C. Now, again, more than likely, Vietnam would want to produce a combination of both apples and oranges. So now we can see what is Vietnam's opportunity cost. Label this Vietnam. Let's go ahead and put here apples. Measured in tons. Oranges, also measured in tons. They are going to choose point B. And point B for Vietnam is going to be 150 apples and 450 oranges. So on the right-hand side, we can now look at Vietnam's opportunity cost. Apples on the x-axis, oranges on the y-axis. So again, it's what Vietnam will sacrifice over what they will gain. If Vietnam will focus on apples, they're going to sacrifice 450 oranges. They're going to gain 150 apples. This gives us 3 for oranges. So if Vietnam produces 1 more apple, they are going to give up 3 oranges. Now, when we focus on oranges, if Vietnam will produce oranges, they're going to sacrifice 150 apples. They're going to gain the 450 oranges. And this gives us 1/3 apples. So if Vietnam is going to produce 1 more orange, they're going to give up 1/3 of the production of an apple. So it looks as if that Vietnam's opportunity cost is much less if Vietnam produces oranges and not apples. So on the graph, it seems to show that Vietnam would be better off if they were to choose all oranges and no apples at all. But the question is, why do both countries still want to insist at point B as their production of apples and oranges? And the answer could come down to multiple reasons. Number one, it could be because trade is not seen as feasible when you have countries with different governmental backgrounds. You may also have other factors such as what we call the infant industry situation, when you have a very, very young industry that's still looking to find its own protection. You may have other issues such as a country wanting to protect its own domestic producers for the fear of what we call dumping prices that are much lower in a country from another country as they export its goods. So there are multiple reasons why we don't really see trade deals come together as fast, in this case between the U.S. and Vietnam.